Let's start as we mean to go on. Thanks and welcome everyone. I'm Councillor Darren Sanders. I'm the Liberal Democrat member for Baffins, North Milton and South Copner, and I'm also the Cabinet member for Housing and Tackling Homelessness. Please, thank you everyone for coming today. Before I begin, I have to do some housekeeping just in case everything goes wrong. If the continuous fire alarm sounds, please evacuate the room and public gallery by the stairwells. Do not attempt to use the lifts. Please assemble at Queen Victoria's statue in Guildhall Square. In order to comply with the fire marshal regulations of the Guildhall Trust in whose building we are using today, anyone who signed in at the reception desk, please sign out when leaving the building at the end of today's meeting. Now, this meeting is being live streamed, so everyone speaking via a microphone will be on camera, including those making deputations, and we'll come to that in a bit. Members of the press and public are also permitted to record the meeting on the understanding that it neither disrupts the meeting nor records those stating explicitly they don't want to be recorded. Please can everyone use the microphones and remember to switch them off when they have finished. So I'll make introductions for those people who don't know each other or who are going on the live stream, starting on my far left.
Alison Harper, Democratic Services.
And then I'll go from the back and then snake around. James.
Good morning, James Hill, Director of Housing, Neighbourhood and Building Services.
Good morning, Mark Fitch, Head of Local Authority Housing.
Morning, Phil Bentley, Head of Estate Services.
Steve Groves, Head of Building Maintenance.
Adam Hardwick, Assistant Director Buildings.
Alan Denford, Finance Manager for the Housing Revenue Account.
Sally Scattergood, Assistant Director for Housing.
And then I'll go to the front row if that's all right, Graham.
Councillor Graham Mahaney, I'm Deputy Leader of the Labour Group and I'm standing in for Councillor Charlotte Gerardo, who is on maternity leave.
Raymond Dent, Councillor for Copner Ward.
Cal Corkery, Councillor for Charles Dickens Ward.
And now the final four, I'll snake in. I know you two have just arrived, so sorry about this. Who are you, my love? Mandy from Paulsgrove will do me fine, Mandy. Thank you very much for coming down. Mark, oh, grief, it's the Paulsgrove Mafia. Right, okay, thank you very much, Mark and Mandy, for coming in. And what's your connection today? Are you here purely because you're tenants or because you're members of the Residents' Consortium? Excellent, thank you very much. Nicola.
Hello, Nicola Clanahan, Head of Housing Community Services.
Good morning, Trevor Lovett, leaseholder in Portsmouth, an elected member of Residents' Consortium.
Okay, thank you very much for all that. So the first thing to note is, do we have any deputations I referred to earlier? No. Right, okay. I have, as Graham has outlined, one apology for absence, who is Councillor Charlotte Gerardo, who remains on maternity leave, which we hope is all going well. The next bit involves Graham, Ray, Cal and me, which is whether we have any declarations of interest. Do any of us have any declarations of interest? Cal?
Personal interest in I'm a council tenant.
That's fine, thank you very much for that. So we now move to the council agenda today, which has two items on it. The first of which is the council's housing budget. For those who don't know, this is the bit where all the rents are set and all the charges are set. And I want to start by asking Alan Denford, who's the finance manager, to talk to the report that's all been published.
Thank you, Councillor Sanders. Good morning, everyone. Today I'm presenting the Housing Revenue Account Budget Report for the 24-25 financial year. The report seeks the Cabinet Member's decision on the setting of rent, service charges and other charges, taking into account the views of tenants. This year's rent consultation started with a line-by-line review of the current budget in September 2023. This information was also in the winter edition of the House Talk magazine. There was then a meeting with the Residents' Consortium and a letter to residents in December. Both of these set out the draft officer proposals and asked for feedback ahead of today's meeting. The initial comments from tenants were reported back to another meeting of the Residents' Consortium on the 4th of January 2024, and these responses are set out in Appendix 10 of the report. You will note that there were 29 responses, and of these, 15 specifically argued for a lower level of service charge, while 10 responses proposed a lower rent increase. Where other issues were raised, which were specific to individual tenants, these were passed on to the appropriate housing officer. I will now run through the report recommendations and outline where proposals differ from those in the consultation. Recommendation 1 notes the forecast outturn for 2023-2024. There's a deficit of 132,000, which is an improved position compared to the original budgeted deficit of 1.3 million. This is despite increased costs of materials to undertake repairs and a higher than budgeted staff pay award, as described in paragraph 4.1.3 of the report. Recommendations 2 and 3 deal with the rent setting. It is proposed to increase the rents by 7.7% from Monday the 1st of April 2024. This is the maximum allowed under the government's rent standard. This increase would see average rents rise from £100.34 per week to £107.48 per week, up by £7.14 per week. However, paragraph 3.3.5 states that rents will be limited to the published local housing allowance or LHA rate. This means that if tenants are already in receipt of housing related benefits and their personal circumstances don't change, any increase in rent will be covered by their benefits. It's worth noting that the latest modelling indicates that an 8.25% rent increase would have been needed to cover forecast costs for the next year. If a 7.7% rent increase is approved today, the resulting budget deficit in 2024-25 of 446,000 will be funded by a draw on the revenue reserve. The table in paragraph 6.1 illustrates a forecast 5-year draw on reserves of circa 3.5 million, which is unsustainable in the longer term, and officers are committed to continuing their deficit reduction programme, which has been running for over 3 years now. Moving on to recommendations 4 to 7, which seek approval for increases in the general service charge and the sheltered housing charge. They also consider the level of laundry and heating charges. All of these proposals continue the policy of full cost recovery so that the residents receiving the services pay for them. The general service charge proposals are in Appendix 5. The proposal for the lower rate for houses and bungalows is an increase from £7.14 per week to £7.28 per week. This rise of 14 pence per week is lower than the 28 pence per week increase in the consultation letter. The proposal for the higher rate service charge for flats and masonettes is an increase from £18.20 per week to £19.60 per week. This rise of £1.40 per week is again lower than the £1.82 per week increase proposed in the consultation. The proposed sheltered housing charges are detailed in Appendix 6. The charges and the respective increases are dependent on the level of service. As with the general service charges, the proposed increases are lower than those detailed in the consultation letter. Category 1 increases by £1.01 per week rather than £1.27 per week. Category 2 by £2.64 rather than £3.49 per week. And Category 3 by £5.13 rather than £6.72 per week. The proposed laundry charges are in Appendix 7. These were increased last year for the first time in 5 years, and no further increase is proposed. Moving on to the proposed heating charges for the 15 blocks that receive landlord heating, as detailed in Appendix 8, the Council's Building Services team continue to undertake work to both reduce energy consumption and negotiate the best tariffs with our energy providers. This included a fixed price electricity contract which protected tenants in Edgbaston and Tipton House from the worst of the recent energy inflation. This contract ended in September 2023 and a new fixed tariff annual contract has now been secured, giving price certainty for the first 6 months of next year. However, unit rates are significantly higher than the previous deal, meaning an increase in charges is necessary. The good news is that as the market for electricity continues to improve, it has been possible to propose that the increase is 2.5% rather than the 10.5% in the consultation. A purchase of gas was also made for part of next year's requirement as prices stabilised. As a result, a reduction in charges was proposed in the consultation for both gas heating and combined heat and power. As with electricity, further improvements in the gas market in January has allowed higher reductions to be proposed in the report. A price reduction of 28.6% is recommended for the Dickens blocks, up from 20.6% in the consultation, and a reduction of 37.2% in the shelter blocks is an improvement on the original 28.6%. Proposals for garage and parking site rents are set out in Appendix 9. An increase of 6.7% in line with the September 2023 Consumer Price Index is proposed for all sites in Recommendation 8. The policy of charging more for non-locals is retained. Recommendations 9 and 10 seek approval for next year's revenue budget and give authority for managers to incur expenditure. The final recommendation notes the forecast revenue budgets up to 2027-28, as referred to earlier, and they are set out in Appendix 3. I would now be happy to take any questions on the report's contents. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Just for our new friends from the Residents' Consortium, I'll just explain how this meeting works, if that's all right, which is that I ask people from the Residents' Consortium to give any questions or comments. Feel free to ask whatever you like, it doesn't matter, first. Then I will go to political colleagues, and then I will sum up, if that's okay. And thank you. You did a wonderful ringtone there. I'll borrow it later. Thank you very much. I'll start with Trevor, if that's all right, from the Residents' Consortium. Thank you, Trevor.
Thank you. I note from the minutes that the general service charge, it says at 4.6, provision of the service, but on the basis of fixed service charges, so there is never any under or over recovery reconciliation instead. Is that specifically targeted at council tenants, or is it council tenants and leaseholders?
I know you're looking at me, Trevor, but I would much rather, if it's okay, if the finance officer answered that question first.
Sorry.
That's okay, no, apologise, it's all right.
Yes, thank you for the question. So that fixed service charge and not having a reconciliation at year end is for tenants. With leaseholders, you may know that there is a reconciliation at year end, so that is taken on board what the actual charges were during the year.
Yeah. Another one? Thank you. You mentioned that the council tenants do not are not involved in any reconciliation. My understanding of the way leaseholders are charged, as you say here, it's what the last year's figure was plus an increase, inflationary increase. However, I was told quite specifically, and I'm glad to say that person is not in the room, that the way leaseholders' charges are worked is an average of the last 3 years. That's obviously against what you're saying.
Sorry, I think Mark will have the detail behind that. Thank you, Mark.
I think you're completely correct, Trevor. Leaseholder service charges are calculated in a very different way to tenant service charges. So tenant service charges are fixed. We don't calculate reconciliations of over-under collections for tenants, and we don't recover or pay back those costs, and they are usually based on previous year's estimates. Service charges for leaseholders are variable, and as you know, we do have under and over collections which we have to tell you by law within the 18-month rule, so by September of the following year for the service charge year. And we do try to base the estimate on the last 3 years' estimates to try and smooth the increases. So they are based on what we know we've spent over the last 3 years, rather than year on year, just inflating it by whatever the inflation rate is. So we do try and look at what the costs were over the last 3 years to base your estimates on. So it is a very different way of calculating service charges between tenants and leaseholders.
I suppose I would ask the question, Mark, is why are they calculated differently? It's the same, I've looked at what's included in leaseholders' charges, I've looked at what's included in council house tenants' charges, and it's broadly the same package of items.
So yeah, fundamentally, most of the services are the same. It just depends on the lease agreement says that your service charges have to be variable. Our tenancy agreements say we do our service charges on a fixed basis. So if our tenancy agreement said we would do them on a variable basis, they would be calculated in the same way. But the local authority tenancy agreement, the assured tenancy says that they're fixed service charges. That's the only reason why they're calculated differently. But fundamentally, they are the same services.
I'll finish off this particular point. There is more than a reasonable chance, there is more than a reasonable chance that leaseholder charges will increase more than what council tenant charges will.
So in terms of the leaseholder charges, so the leaseholder, the way that they are calculated, we will only ever charge you what has been spent. So, you know, because it's based on, I think what you're thinking about is the estimate. So the estimate is based on what we have seen happen over the previous 3 years, plus what we can foresee is likely to happen in that coming year. So that's always an estimate. But as Mark said, then at the end of that finance period, there's a reconciliation exercise, so that you would, if we'd overestimated, the reconciliation would take account of that, look at what you actually spent, and you would then get the difference. So it's a moving piece, if you like, with leaseholder charges, because they are variable. That's the key thing about them. They will vary, but you will only ever pay what you've actually used in that building in terms of services and utility costs.
So it comes down to one word, really, which is variable.
Yes.
Right, okay. I think I've only got one more question, Chairman.
That's fine, don't worry.
I remember, this is regarding bad debt. I remember asking a question over the last 2 years at Residents Consortium, was how you increase, or how you allow for bad debt. Because my argument, or my thought process was, with rents going up, inflation, the way the economy was, that I felt that the council would have to consider, for want of a better word, evicting council tenants if they got into too much arrears. Now, obviously, you don't want that to happen. But I noticed in the 5-year budget that in 23-24, the debt management costs, the decrease in provision for bad debt was 216, changing in 24-25 to 512, and the debt management costs proportionally actually didn't change all that much. So why is there such a big increase or reduction going from 23 to 24 to 24 to 25?
Yeah, thank you for that question. The figure you see there for 2023-24 is the actual contribution that we made into our provision last year based on the actual level of debts at year end. So we would have budgeted for a higher contribution, but we then do work looking at the age debt profile at year end and work out how much we do need to put into that provision. So you know, you're right, it was good news last year that the level of debt hadn't got significantly higher, but we are still being very prudent in putting budgeting to put more money into the bad debt provision in future years, because of the current cost of living position. So at the moment, we're not seeing any massive increase in our arrears, but we're being prudent in budgeting for that in future years. Do you want to say something about rent arrears, Sally?
Yeah, so as Alan says, we aren't actually seeing a huge spike in arrears. In fact, I think compared to other housing providers, we compare favourably. And I think that's down to the work that we put in terms of our housing officers are all trained to be able to provide advice around benefit and income maximisation, and we'll work with our tenants where they express any concerns about their ability to pay rents. So we'll always sit down, work with them to make sure they are getting all the benefits they're entitled to, and we can do debt and benefit advice. But we'll also have our money advice team who can work with tenants on more complex sort of debt or finance issues to ensure that they get the support that they need.
Thank you. Just to finish, thank you for that. This is only my second meeting and I'm still finding my way around this room and what I should and shouldn't be doing. So thank you very much.
That's all right. Trevor, we've got two people at their first meeting, they've decided their second, so thank you very much. The idea is to be as open as we can, particularly with the Residents' Consortium, which is the statutory for those people who don't know, it's the body we have to consult, and we like consulting when it comes to things like this and key policies, so it's absolutely important that we're as open as we can be on these matters. Now, I think Mr. Ringtone goes next, because I like the ringtone. You're okay, are you? You sure? Okay. Hello. Are you? Please ask any questions or have any comments. You okay? All right. Thank you very much. Right, Daniel. Good morning. I didn't want to say hello before you'd actually got settled because it looked like you'd been behind a bike or a van for like 20 minutes or whatever it is. Please switch your mic on. Clearly, this is not good morning so far. Come on, let's make it better.
Morning, everyone.
And I know who you are, but others may not. So just give us, for the record.
I'm Councillor Daniel Weems for Hillsey Ward.
Okay, that's fine. And do you have any declarations of interest?
No interest at all.
Okay, thank you very much. So the next stage is to ask for the questions and comments from the political representatives. So I'll start with Cal from the Portsmouth Community Independence Group.
Thank you, Darren. Got a few questions you might be surprised to hear. I will start with some of the clarifications, I guess, before I make some of the more substantial points. First one is just a simple question. Why the parking and garage charges are proposed to be increased at a lower rate than the rents and the higher rate service charge?
Thank you. This basically is repeating the policy we've had in previous years in increasing them by the Consumer Price Index. It's based on that indication of inflation.
Okay. I accept the answer, but I'm not quite sure I agree with the policy, because what that means is there are people who may be on very high incomes and are not even council tenants who are using parking spaces in the city centre because it's cheaper than paying to park in the NCP car park or elsewhere, and we're increasing the charges we apply to those people at a lower rate than we do council tenants living within our properties for their rents. Which to me doesn't quite seem fair. I think at least an equivalence in terms of any increase in charge would be a fairer policy. But I'll move on from that. Next one, in terms of the setting out of the various kind of income headings and spending on page 23, which I think is Appendix 3, the main thing that caught my eye in terms of kind of an increase that seems to be outside of the norm for the other things listed was the supervision and management costs, which increases from 16.7 million to 20.2 million, which, if my maths is correct, is around 21%. Obviously, seems like a lot just reading it like that. I assume there probably is a good reason. It should be useful to know what it is.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's a similar answer to the one I gave around the bad debt provision, in that the forecast outturn for the current year is based on all that we know about what's actually happening in the various service areas. So there will be a number of vacant posts that will contribute to that number being as low as it is. But then, as well as that, in each of the following years, we've included an assumption around a pay award. So, so I think in some ways, what I'm saying is, in the current year, vacant posts mean that number is artificially low because we're holding posts vacant. So the original budget would have been higher, but then for next year, there's an assumption around a pay award.
Okay. So the increase is 21% compared to what was spent this year. Assuming pay award is 4%, we're talking about, what, 17% difference? Are we saying that we're holding 17% of posts vacant?
I wouldn't have the exact figures, but there are a high number of posts being vacant. And so for next year, we'll be budgeting on full establishment. And then any vacancies in the year will then be in our monitoring for that year's budget. So looking at whether the deficit's going up or down.
Okay. And when we say posts are being held vacant, presumably that is intentionally as opposed to they can't be recruited to, is it? Or is it a mix?
It will be different in each service area. In some instances, if we're looking to do a reorganisation, then we'll hold posts vacant. In others, it's just because there's been a high turnover in the year and issues around recruitment. So there'll be a variety of answers to those. If you want to add anything to that, Sally.
Yeah, so I think the way to think about it is it's not necessarily that it's set posts that are statically empty across the year. It's a number of posts coming in that may be vacant for a period and then being filled, and other posts becoming vacant. So they'll all contribute to that figure. And as Alan said, there'll be varying reasons. Some it will be, it's just the standard recruitment period. Some others it will be that there are thoughts going on around what should that role look like, so it may take a bit longer to recruit that role, and others, if they're more senior roles, their recruitment can just take longer. It also, over the last couple of years, recruitment has been more difficult for all sectors, I think, in terms of recruitment. So sometimes recruitment takes longer than it would have done, a number of years ago.
Sorry, Cal, I hate interrupting, but I just check because I don't think the answer's totally clear. Are you suggesting that the 24-25 figure for this is a realistic estimate as opposed to an actual figure? Is that correct?
It's based on the full establishment of posts in the structures. So there's an assumption that we will fill all of those posts. There is a small vacancy factor built in.
Okay. So I said realistic estimates as opposed to unrealistic estimates other councils do. So I suspect the answer to my question is yes, which therefore I think partly answers your point, Cal. Sorry to interrupt you, I hate doing it, but it didn't seem clear, that was all.
Yeah, no, thanks, Dan. Yeah, I think that's helpful because that does lead on to one of the kind of points I wanted to make, is that it seems likely, therefore, that figure, the outturn, will in fact be lower if the factors that have affected recruitment this year is replicate next year. So there's potentially some money to play with there, or some kind of discrepancy in what the budget outcome will be. I'll move on. In terms of, I know we've talked about full cost recovery, and again, that is based on estimates for the year to come. We know that last year's budget contained estimates around energy prices and energy costs, which weren't borne out, and obviously there was a decision to actually significantly decrease the amount we were going to be charging people for energy in their homes where it's directly provided, such as the Dickens blocks. And the end result of that has meant that this year tenants have been charged several £100s less than they otherwise potentially would have been, which is obviously several £100s back in people's pockets. So I guess my question is, given that uncertainty last year and the kind of significant discrepancy between the prediction and what actually came about, how confident are we in the assumptions that have been made this year around full cost recovery?
Yeah, thank you. It's a very good question, and one we've sort of thought long and hard over. The current position with both gas and electricity is that we have contracts in place that gives us certainty in the first 6 months of the year. In the original proposals, that were in the consultation letter, our assumption was that prices in the second half of the year would be the same as in the first half of the year. What we've seen in January is an improvement in both the gas and electricity market, so that we're able to say our intelligent, if you like, best guess as to what the cost will be in the second half of the year is that they will be able to purchase gas and electricity at a lower rate than in the first half of the year. That has enabled us to go back and reduce the proposed charges across all of those types of heating. But you're absolutely right, there's no absolute certainty. This is the best intelligence that we have on where the market is at the moment, but it can obviously be thrown again by world events.
Okay, thank you. Moving on again, in terms of the living wage, which people will no doubt be aware has been a kind of a hot topic of debate for the council in previous years. We've previously heard that the housing revenue account, in terms of its supply chain, because all directly employed staff will be paid at least the real living wage, but we also want to look at the contractors that the councils use and how much they're paying people. We've previously been told, and correct me if I'm wrong, that up until now, contractors within the housing revenue account have, on the whole, more or less, kind of been paying at least the real living wage. But we heard at Employment Committee meeting yesterday that due to the expected or the proposed increase in the real living wage in the year to come, there's now going to be a discrepancy of around £200,000. So I just wondered, is that factored into the budget in anywhere, or are we now going to have contractors no longer paying the real living wage that they were? And yeah, what the situation is.
Yeah, I think in previous years, most of our service providers have met that, but it's not been by like policy. It's just because that's a sort of market factor. So we still need to work with them around their sort of pay awards, and there's a balance between obviously, you know, achieving the real living wage, but also retaining staff and recruiting staff into the organisation. So I can't give any certainty as to whether they will meet the real living wage or not. But we've budgeted a factor for a pay award, but I think to go to the full real living wage would be above what we've budgeted. Is that fair? Yeah. That answers the question.
Just out of interest, what roles are we talking about? Because I guess in my mind, a lot of the typically low-paid roles that might be associated with the housing revenue account seem to be provided in-house, and the contractor services tend to be, my perception is that they're more skilled tradesperson roles who would be paid well above that anyway.
Yeah, from a contractor perspective, the sort of roles that come under the real living wage or at that sort of area are sort of like their call handlers, resource admin staff, but also their delivery drivers, labourers. So they're sort of unskilled operatives, if you like.
Okay, thank you. Just a question, I think I've asked most years, but just to get clarity again this year, in terms of the difference between the lower service charge and the higher service charge, I think one's proposed to increase by 2% and one's proposed to increase by 7-point-something%. What's the reason for the discrepancy in terms of the increases?
Sorry, you're asking about the difference in the increase? Yes. It's mainly because there's a higher level of staff involvement on that higher service charge. So it's effectively been driven by the estimates around the pay award for next year. And also there's some element that's driven by material costs. So, but predominantly it's because there's a higher proportion of staffing input on those higher service charges.
Okay, thank you. I guess I'll just finish by making some more general points, if I can pass on more detailed questions. In terms of the proposed rent increases and the higher level service charge, which I guess most tenants paid, or everyone that lives in blocks of flats at least, obviously 7.7% is a significant proportion of people's money that they're now going to have to pay out if this gets agreed. People are still struggling with the cost of living crisis, and a lot of people's wages aren't increasing by these significant amounts. I know it's noted within the report about the living wage, and that will surely benefit those people that are on that minimum wage. But there are lots and lots of people who earn that little bit more, still not a great amount of money by any means, who are going to struggle to find an extra 7.7% in the year to come. And I think there is a strong argument, particularly with some of the points that have been noted today around uncertainty, around perhaps estimates that may well not be borne out, and also the fact that there are still significant reserves, although slightly dwindling year on year. I think there's a strong argument to reduce that level of proposed increase down significantly to give people a little bit more breathing room while they're still experiencing these kind of severe cost of living pressures. As well as that, I think there's obviously one significant factor of uncertainty in the coming year that we haven't discussed, and that's the national policy framework. So it may well be that in a year's time we've got a change of government who I would hope are at least a little bit more sympathetic towards those living in social housing and those managing it. And that could have an impact, therefore, on the housing revenue account financial position in the years to come. So one significant factor of uncertainty that it may well be worth kind of bearing in mind when we're considering whether we need to go ahead and charge people the very maximum when we can, or whether we look at how that can potentially be reduced in order to ease the burden on people's finances. And then one last point, which another point I make every year, is around the kind of extra financial provision for people that fall into severe hardship that could be made available for council tenants. I know I've made the point in previous years that some social landlords, for example, the largest housing association who operates in Portsmouth, that I've detailed knowledge of through working for them previously, they have a ring-fenced amount of money every year that's taken from rents, that's put aside as a hardship fund. I think they call it the welfare fund, and that's available for people who really need it if they've recently lost their job, had their benefits cut, moved into a property that's unfurnished and they need to buy white goods or put down flooring, all these kind of essential costs that people will inevitably meet. There's a pot of money there that can be dipped into that's specifically ring-fenced for them in their status as tenants. That is kind of separate from any other money that may be made available. I know that in last year and the year before, the response was, well, we've got the government's money, I've forgot what it's called now, the cost of living type ring-fence money, household support funds. We've got the household support funds. We now know that's not going to increase, so that won't be available, and that's not going to continue, sorry, so that potentially won't be available in future for people to fall back on. But what I think I'm arguing for is something that is specific funds that's ring-fenced for the housing revenue account, for council tenants, taken out of council rents and then redistributed to the people that most need it within that financial year. I think there's a strong argument for money to be put aside for that purpose, so that there's, again, a bit more of a buffer, a bit more of a safety net for people who fall on hard times, and there's a bit more extra support there when they really need it. Thank you.
Cal, thank you as always. Ray.
As always, Cal's asked most of the questions. Just one, I want clarity on one. The gas and electricity, is it a 6-month fixed-term contract we're in at the moment, or is it a flexible contract?
I'm not the expert on energy contracts, but as I understand it, with electricity, it's a 12-month contract, which is 6 months in the current financial year and 6 months in next year, which is why I talked about certainty for 6 months on electricity. I think gas, there's both fixed and variable elements. Thank you.
Yes, so with utility costs, we have options over how we buy it. So we buy ahead basically. So we've bought our gas ahead for 6 months, and with that we have options over. If there's a lot of uncertainty, we can buy longer. But as at the moment we're seeing prices coming down, so it makes sense to not buy too far in the future on the basis that if they come down further, then we could buy the remaining 6 months at a lower price. So it's a bit of a balance between when we buy and how long for. And we do that based on monitoring the market and getting advice on where we anticipate it going, really, if that makes sense.
Does that make sense, Ray?
Yeah, because from my knowledge within the industry is that gas prices are going to level out come April, maybe a little bit later in the year, but lower than we are at the moment. So that's the reason why I want to see it as a fixed term contract. Cheers.
Thank you for that, Ray. Daniel.
Thank you. I think my first point is more of a comment than a question, and then I'll ask my actual question. With inflation, such as food inflation going down, and indeed other parts of CPI going down as well, a lot of residents' comments in this document are quite concerned that they're not getting value for money for their maintenance as well as the service being provided. So asking residents to pay a lot more, I would say a substantial increase in rents and then receiving the same service, which most of these residents have obviously commented aren't happy with. How can we ensure that they're going to get value for money moving forward? So if we're asking them to pay X amount more, how are we ensuring that we're giving them the best service possible for that increased amount of money they're paying? That's the first one. I guess it is a question at the end. And then the second one relates to the vulnerability of tenants. So I kind of want to echo Cal's comments. How are we going to ensure that all tenants are going to be provided the support as well as the information needed to ensure that they've got the best practice for spending their money, indeed saving money when they need to? Because I know that a lot of tenants are concerned, and the one that I'm a bit nervous about actually is those who are already in arrears. So what support are we providing them to ensure that it doesn't just spiral, the debt doesn't spiral further with them?
Yeah, thanks, Councillor. So in terms of value for money, I think part of what we've picked up is through the consultation, which we've had a better response this year. So we've had more responses, which is really good and really helpful for us. What we've picked up is there is work that we need to do so that our tenants understand the services that they are getting that contribute to the cost of those service charges. So that's something that we will be doing. We're trying to get residents more involved with the consortium so that they have that understanding of the services that are provided and therefore why the charges are that way. But in terms of providing value for money, obviously we are constantly looking at the costs that we incur as part of the services, and we are always doing the best that we can to make sure that we're minimising those costs whilst not compromising the level of service. What we'll do is we'll lead by our tenants around where the services need to be, particularly in the grounds maintenance and in the cleaning. So we don't send operatives out just for the sake of it. So, a lot of contracts will be set up so that you'll have a routine cleaning schedule where they'll go out every day on this day at this time they'll clean, or once a week or whatever it is, even if the building doesn't need cleaning. So we have our estate managers who contribute to going out and looking at where the issues are on the estate, and we also learn from the data that we hold how often we need to be going to those buildings, and we can flex and increase and drop off. Well, if we get customer demand coming in saying you need to clean this building, then of course we'll add in an extra one. But we're trying to make sure that we're not going out delivering services unnecessarily, and we're focusing our resources where they're needed rather than spending where they're not. So that's the way that we constantly monitor that. Phil with his guys and with the contractors as well, we constantly monitoring where we're spending money and are led by the information that we have about where we need to deliver those services most, balancing that with trying to sort of educate our tenants through the consortium so that they can understand where those services are delivered, how they're delivered, and how they contribute to the costs, so that they can then provide that challenge to us as well. Okay.
And just to follow up on with that, if we have a few residents who may not necessarily engage with the consortium, how are we ensuring they're aware of all these changes and indeed are getting that? They feel like they've got the buy-in with the council, so they've actually been consulted with. I'm just worried that there's a few isolated tenants who may not necessarily feel comfortable speaking in a public forum.
Dan, you can't see, but James, who is the director, has raised his hand. So.
Oh, brilliant. Sorry, apologies.
No,
that's
apologise,
fine.
it's fine, don't worry.
Thank you, Councillor Sanders. And actually, I wanted to answer the question because I wanted to pick up on an earlier point. So this year, Councillor Weems, we sent a letter to every single tenant and leaseholder, whereas in previous years we've used House Talk and the winter edition, which has contained the content. This year we've parted company doing that, and that's actually got us more feedback than we've ever had before through distributing the letter. Tenants also have contact, as you know, in the community with their housing officer teams and so on. So we use various channels to make tenants and leaseholders aware of the proposals to gain as much feedback as possible. And I just wanted to pick up on an earlier point, because I think it was stated at the start of the meeting before you arrived, just a point that the feedback you see in the report is feedback that we received on the basis of the letter that we sent, which was the original proposals at that time. Alan touched on this in his introduction, that the report now contains revised proposals. So some of that comment will be on the original basis of the service charge that was proposed. I hope those residents, when they see the final report, assuming it's agreed today, will be pleased with the movement, because we've been able to take into consideration some of their feedback.
Thanks, Roger. Do you have any further questions or comments, Dan? No? Thank you, Daniel. Graham.
Thank you, Darren. I have detailed questions to start with. On paragraph 5.3, it talks about the budget not being included for any national domestic rate costs for HRA car parks because proposed charges are subject to an appeal process. Is that because we haven't paid it before and it's a new charge, or it's a charge that might increase and therefore we haven't accounted for that? I was a little unclear about what that was and what the level of risk is. I'm assuming it's not massive, but I'd just be interested to know.
Graham, I know the outlines of an answer, but you deserve the details, so I'll hand it over to Alan.
Okay, others may know more of the detail than I do, but this is a proposed new charge that we're appealing against. At the moment, we feel confident that that appeal will be successful, at least in part, which is why we haven't budgeted for that cost in the year. But I felt it was only right that we should highlight that as a risk that would have to be covered from the revenue reserve if we do need to pay any NDR charges on our car parks.
Thank you for that. Just to come back on the issue of the increase. I mean, I noted I had a look at the news yesterday, and I noted their report on the on the budget, and it talks about your comments about it, and it says a bit further down, it says a council spokesperson stated that the proposed rate is insufficient to maintain landlord services. To do so, the rent would need to be increased by 8.25%. If I read the report correctly, the government have set a rule which says we can only raise it by 7.7. So in effect, what the government's doing is effectively I agree with the comments that Councillor Falkbury's made about the cost increases. I mean, obviously rent levels are important, and we have tenants on low incomes. One of the areas where we should provide, or we used to provide support for tenants, was in relation to council tax benefit. Prior to the government that was in 2010-2015, the coalition government, council tax benefit was available at 100% relief. Now tenants are forced to pay 20%. And although we do work to try and alleviate hardship, that obviously is something that the City Council controls, and was a decision of the previous administration to do that, Liberal Democrat administration. And I do think it's something we should consider. I recognise there is a cost involved. I have raised this before. I understand that in order to bring the rate down from 20% to 15%, it would cost about £500,000. That's for all council tax benefit players. And whilst I recognise that we have other budget pressures as well, I do hope the administration would consider possibly thinking about phasing a reduction so we can go back to that. Because you have to remember, not every council does this. Oxford City Council, for example, still gives 100% relief on council tax benefit. Other councils have adopted different positions. A few of them, I think one or two actually pay a flat rate, if you like, on it as a result of the coalition government's austerity programme. I do think it's something we need to consider, because obviously it's affecting the poorest tenants. So that's really something I shall just leave for the administration to consider. The other thing I wanted to ask about finally is the level of in-year deficits which are forecast. They are obviously increasing, and clearly if the policy remains the same, we're going to have to find cuts or savings in order to do that. How confident are we that we can manage those deficits? I recognise it's a bit of a finger in the air job up to a point, but I mean, I'm just wanting to know how confident are that we can find savings to reduce that deficit.
Do you mind if I get James to answer that, if that's okay, Graham?
Thank you, Councillor Sanders. My answer to that is I feel confident that we can continue to find efficiencies and certainly resolve the in-year deficit going forward, so next financial year. There is still, as the report talks to, an issue in the longer term over the life of the HRA business plan, which is 30 years, and that's linked to multiple factors, but one about the age of the stock. So there is a piece of work that is underway around an asset management strategy, which will help us take some longer term strategic decisions about the housing stock going forward and address some of the consequences of the way in which we're currently maintaining and repairing stock, for example. But the short answer is, in terms of next year, we've got work underway. We've got plans in place which I feel very confident that we'll do what you've seen in this financial year, which is start from an accountant's point of view of how they need to show the accounts, which is 1.3 million deficit this financial year, but in reality we had a lot of work underway and we achieved a reduction in that, so the deficit was only 132k. Next year, I feel very confident we can resolve that issue whilst looking at the longer term plan, and the report gives some indication of some thoughts around that, which we'll share with members in due course.
Thank you for that, James. Graham, any further questions or comments? No, thank you very much indeed. So this is now my turn. Firstly, thank you very much to everyone for their questions and comments. I hope that's been helpful. It may not have liked all the answers, but I think that's been helpful. As colleagues have said, this remains a challenging time for all of us. I mean, the cost of living crisis continues for many. We may end up in a technical recession at the end of last year, but the cost of doing things like fixing kitchens continues to rise. Now, as Graham has pointed out, this council, like others of all stripes, face tough choices when it comes to rents. For instance, the Conservative Independent Coalition in Hartlepool has approved a 7.7% rent rise. Labour councils like Kirklees have done the same. That's not a political attack, it's just a statement of reality. So when looking at this decision, there's various principles I have to take as the sole decision maker. So I want to outline them for colleagues. The first is to make sure that the housing revenue account is financially stable in the long term. We've had some discussion around that. Now, we've heard the horror stories of councils like Thurrock and Birmingham, and my Lib Dem party knows that all too well, because we've had to clear up the messes of places like Woking and Somerset. I do note in the report, and this comes back to some of the comments that were made earlier, that every 1% reduction in rent below this cap would lose £800,000 this year, and more than £40 million. I'm going to repeat that again, £40 million over 30 years. Now, that's money that can't be spent repairing people's homes, keeping open adventure playgrounds, or having wardens keep our residents safe. I'm not quite sure what the morality is around cutting those services. Someone will tell me. But even as Graham again has rightly outlined, even not doing this leaves a deficit. And that means, Daniel, the efficiency programme will continue. We have to make sure that, as you rightly point out, if our residents are to face these rises, they need to know that we're doing all we can to cut out waste. That is absolutely essential. That has begun, as you've heard. It will continue. It's already paying some dividends, but it has to continue. The second principle, which is one that Cal very briefly touched on, is the external financial situation. Now, many colleagues won't know, but a few years ago I approved a below recommended rise in rents because this government was not offering any help. That we could do that and stay financially okay. This year we see a nearly 10% rise in the minimum wage and an 8.5% rise in pensions, thanks to the triple lock that the coalition government, or our bit of the coalition government, delivered. That's a significant amount of external assistance, even if other government support falls off a cliff edge. Cal raised that earlier, and I want to come back to that later. I also note, finally, a rise in the local housing allowance. This not happening has increased homelessness. That's a moral shame, as well as stupid economics, because it means the council taxpayer's got to pick up the bill. We continue to cap rents at the local housing allowance level, so no one pays more in rent than they would get in housing benefit. That is a moral choice we make. It is the right choice. Nothing has changed financially to change that. My third principle is actually looking at the total bill facing our residents. Now, colleagues know I'll listen to all good ideas. Cal quite rightly mentioned his persuasion of me to ease the heating charges for people in certain blocks last year. That was the right decision to take, and as Cal's indicated, that's generated benefits. Well, I have to say, as Alan indicated earlier, the listening started earlier this time, and I want to thank those who wrote in and attended the Residents' Consortium meetings. It was clear from those comments that if we could help, we should. And that's why I'm delighted that proposed increase in service charges have been cut as a result of their feedback. And not just their feedback, but I also want to thank, as I thanked Cal last year, this year, the St Thomas Ward councillors for bringing to me the worries of those in Edgbaston and Tipton houses about the increase in heating charges, and as a result, that increase is 8% less than it would otherwise have been. And for those people who came last year, and for people in our living in our sheltered housing, the minus signs you see in your heating charges are real. They are cuts in your heating bill, in some cases of 37%. Where we can help, we will. Prudence with a purpose, you might say. I now want to turn to some points that have emerged from the discussion. Firstly, the point around parking charges. The policy I brought in is to provide higher rates for people who do not live nearby. That is an important principle. We as a council have a wider parking policy. That is under constant review. The joys of the valuation office disagreeing with what we want to do, which we are appealing, is something that we want to appeal because we want to make sure we can carry on with that principle of not having people from the eastern side of the city parking in, for instance, Stamshaw, and believing they can have a lower rate. It is under constant review, but that is an issue that we do have in the short term. On vacant posts, I'll be monitoring that as part of the efficiency drive. We do have to budget prudently, and other councils have suffered from not doing that. As regards to the real living wage, this is discussion that we as councillors have had more than once. Full council does have a policy on the real living wage for contractors, which is wanting to do it if it's financially sustainable. The Employment Committee Cal refers to, which I also sat on and explained the situation, saw that the cost of this now means increasing the housing revenue deficit by £200,000. That's less money on repairs or wardens or adventure playgrounds. That, in line with full council policy, I wish to return to once it becomes financially sustainable. Now, Cal's regular point around hardship funds, as he knows, is always one we keep an eye on. All I can say is that we are working across the council, including in the housing revenue account, on combating any cut in our £3.8 million household support fund grant, the grant that's been helping our pantries and larders offer vital help, as well as helping people on free school meals and those who are just about managing. Several of those people live in council accommodation, which is why I felt confident before about saying there is no need for a hardship fund. That, we know, the autumn statement did not include anything on that, I have to say. Given that it now seems to be doing anything to appease the angry voters who are hovering to view, we live in hope that this government stupidity will not continue. That may be in the March budget, it may be earlier. I hope it's earlier. But regardless, we are working across the council within the housing revenue account on plans to try and deal with it if that stupidity does occur. With regards to the point around value for money, again, that's a fair point, but it's not just the people who responded to this consultation. I also read the recent scrutiny panel, which Cal chaired, on repairs, which said that this council had a better repairs service than housing associations. So we look at everything, and that did include resident feedback. I note that there's a point about cutting charges in year, which again, I would love to do. Some councils have done that, but then again, they found things are worse. They also lost money. And I think that's something we always keep under review, but frankly just isn't going to work, which I feel is a shame. So I don't like increasing rents at all. But given the HRA's financial position, the increase in pensions and minimum wage, the listening that has led to reducing the impacts of service charges, and the fact that rents are capped at housing benefit levels, I agree to the package on offer. So thank you very much, colleagues, for that. I now move to the next item, if I may, which is the fire safety policy. I have Steve Groves, who is down to do that.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Sanders. The purpose of the report is to update members of a review of the existing fire policy that we've undertaken and really to seek approval to implement proposed changes to the policy. The background is that within HMB we do have a fire safety group which meets regularly, and the purpose of that group is to coordinate and communicate fire safety actions, review risk assessments, review audits and inspections, changes to the legislation, and as a result of that keep the policy and the processes up to date to respond to any changes that are required. In January 2023, the fire safety regulations introduced new duties to local authorities or anybody really that owns blocks of flats. And some of those areas included providing local fire service with information about our blocks, up-to-date floor plans and such like, additional monthly checks to firefighting equipment and lifts, and reporting any errors, any repair issues to the fire service, signage, and quarterly fire door checks to communal doors, and annual fire checks to property entrance doors. So some of those changes did initially require changes to our fire policy, and that has been incorporated into the policy. And although that we're seeking approval for the policy now, those changes have been implemented. In terms of the existing fire policy, it talks in the policy about a managed use approach to the communal areas. And what we've found by reviewing the fire risk assessments, there is a conflict between when the fire risk assessments are undertaken and the issues and recommendations that they find, where there's a conflict in terms of how those communal areas are actually being managed. And so although there's no legislation stating how we manage communal areas, there is guidance about how we should manage those areas, and work with Hampshire Fire, who are the enforcement authority, to ensure that those areas remain safe. The tenancy agreement does state that communal areas must be kept clear of all personal belongings. And when we did some research with other social housing providers in the local area, such as Vivid, Sanctuary, Sovereign and Clarion, all of those social housing providers already have a zero tolerance approach to managing their communal areas. As I said, fire risk assessments that are undertaken by ourselves and our accredited fire risk assessors frequently highlight issues with managing the communal areas and clearing communal personal belongings. So the recommendation is around a zero tolerance policy for our communal areas, and what a zero tolerance policy approach is to not permit residents to have use of common parts to store any of their belongings, and effectively create a sterile free area of any belongings in those areas. And it's very clear that it means there's no ambiguity regarding what can and cannot be stored. We've had discussions regularly throughout with Hampshire Fire, who are the enforcing authority when it comes to fire safety, and they confirmed that their preference and their support for the proposed change to a zero tolerance approach, as it will not only improve fire protection, but from an operational response perspective, it does mean that regardless of the combustibility of any stored items, they would restrict access, and by not having any of those items in those communal areas, it does mean that they are able to operate and set up in the instance of a fire a lot easier than what they would if there were items in the way. So the reasons for the recommendation for the fire policy to be updated to a zero tolerance approach for general needs blocks of flats is recommended. The exception would be for Cat 2 and 2.5 blocks to continue to have a managed use for their communal areas. And the reason for the difference is that the Cat 2 and 2.5 blocks They have effective restricted access controls, they have fire detection systems, and more importantly, they have scheme managers and staff on site that daily can monitor the items that are being stored in any sort of communal areas. Again, the reason for recommendation is Hampshire Fire have been we've consulted with them throughout the review of the policy, and they've supported the change to a zero tolerance proposal. We've also done consultation over a number of years throughout the development of the policy with the resident consortium and the repairs and maintenance forum, and they've not raised any issues or objections to the approach to go into a zero tolerance approach. And we have also, when issues have been identified in some of the blocks, the estate services team have worked with the residents in those blocks and undertaken a zero tolerance approach and successfully implemented that approach by communicating on an individual basis with the residents to make them aware of the reasons why we're changing that approach in those particular blocks. So in terms of the consultation, engagement and implementation plan, the proposal is to implement the policy from the 1st of April 2024 to enable the policy changes to be communicated to the residents. And the estate services team will phase the implementation of the policy as part of their monthly block inspections, engaging one-to-one with residents and initially focusing on the higher risk blocks. All of the engagement will be in person, and they will work with residents to help them understand the reason and the rationale and help them with any belongings or an agreed timescales for removal of any items. As part of that in-person discussion, they will also be able to gain knowledge around any areas that can be improved to help with that managing of the communal areas. So it might be about better use of some of the other communal spaces. And if residents are not in, we will obviously leave letters and leaflets giving them the same information about the policy and also requesting an in-person visit. And we also do have the option and discussions, and we have used before, Hampshire Fire would support us in if there were any queries from residents, would undertake joint visits, and we frequently do undertake joint visits with Hampshire Fire to visit some of the blocks and explain what the policy is and the approach that we're taking. So our recommendations, as outlined at the start of the report, is to approve the policy and
the colleagues' consideration of what I know as the Oxford scheme. I don't know if it'll work for here, but we'll at least give this a go and consider it. So thank you very much for those comments. That's very kind of you. Right, Residents Consortium colleagues. Trevor. Thank you, Trevor. Our friends from Paulsgrove. Any thoughts or comments, or do you like it?
Yeah, I mean, after reading it through, and recent events that have come to light over the country on the news, etc., I think it would be an excellent idea.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll start at the other end this time. Graham.
So this, the question in the report, it says that this is part of the tenancy already. Is this just a case of reinforcing enforcement as a way of making it? It's not about the new regulations. We've always had this as a policy. That's correct, isn't it?
The policy has always been about managed use, but what we have done is we have implemented that approach when the fire risk assessments have identified there's been particular issues. So that's when the estate services team have gone into particular blocks where there have been issues, and we have gone, because of the risks that have been identified, we have gone to that zero tolerance bit. And this is about really trying to make sure we've got the policy to back that up and to make that more consistent around all of the blocks.
Just to give a couple of examples, I mean, I've seen occasionally in flats, you might see a bike stored underneath the stairs, for example. The other example I've seen in flats is where you've got a common area and you've got windows and maybe a large sort of shelf there. People maybe put some plants there, you know, things like that. Is the zero tolerance going to include things like understairs, plant pots on windowsills, etc.?
Steve or Phil?
Yeah, it'd be me. Yes is the answer. The main reason is there's elements of risk that's obviously mentioned in the report, but then there's issues with persuading residents to take that on board when they see inconsistent application elsewhere. So that's why we're seeking that.
Okay, yeah.
Daniel?
Yeah, just one on smoke detectors. It says that they are mains operated in...
Raymond, now, I know I get you two frequently mixed up, but you're not Daniel.
I do apologise.
You're not Daniel. Trust me. You're not Daniel. No. I try and be fair. Daniel.
Raymond can carry on if he wants. It was basically just following on from Graham's point about the consistency basis, because there's some blocks of flats in Hillsey where people do a similar thing where they have like plants and stuff, and it looks lovely, but I think a couple of residents have said to me where they've asked to be removed, and then in other blocks they haven't. So I think having this policy here where we have that consistency basically just adds to that value, where a resident can say, well, at least it's being upheld in other areas of the city. So I think it's a good policy.
Thank you, Daniel. Raymond. Yes, you're awake now, aren't you?
Yeah, on the smoke detectors, it states that they are mains operated in the hallways, and I'd assume is it battery operated in the properties?
No, in the properties they are mains operated smoke detectors, and they will get checked annually as part of the gas servicing contract.
Okay, does that answer your questions then? Finally, Cal.
Thanks, Darren. I've got a few comments and queries on this. I'll start with the questions and then I can make some general comments again. So just for points of clarity, section 3.5 of the report quotes the PCC tenancy agreement where it describes its definition of communal areas. That includes things such as shared gardens and other housing land. But just to be clear, it's not the intention that this policy is going to apply to those areas.
No, this policy is around the means of escape within blocks of flats.
Okay, that's fine, thank you. Another query, the section on fire doors within the policy, within the appendix, seems to me to state that buildings of certain sizes will be fitted with certain types of fire doors, i.e. high-rise blocks will have replacement FD30s. Now, I know we've discussed fire doors in high-rise blocks a number of times, and in previous years' capital budgets, there's been a commitment to install fire doors in high-rise blocks. Again, we've had a discussion before, but I'll repeat it. We've obviously fed that back to residents. Some residents have been informed that on such and such a date, a month within a year, that's now well in the past, you will have these fire doors installed. That never came about. We've then since had feedback that actually that is under review as part of, I can't remember the exact name, but the work that's going on around high-rise safety. So again, I guess just points of clarity. It states within this policy that those fire doors will be installed in high-rise blocks. Is that definitely the case, or is it subject to the high-rise safety review that's ongoing?
Yeah, just to reassure that all the blocks have got fire doors in them at the moment, so that isn't the issue. And in terms of the issue of the future programmes, that is continuing to be under review, and that will be coming back to Housing Cabinet to sort of state what that programme's going to be. But obviously the piece of work that you're aware of as well is there's a lot of work going on, particularly with the high-rise blocks, to do building safety cases and do further investigation to see exactly what the extent of the work is that needs to be done to those blocks.
Okay, that makes sense. So obviously the doors I'm thinking of in the high-rise blocks within our wards, they're the presumably original, but maybe not, the old kind of wooden doors that have obviously been there for quite some time. Do they currently meet the FD30 standard?
Yes, so I think with our high-rise, we obviously undertake yearly fire risk assessments, and then there may be recommendations in that around doing repairs to doors or upgrades to them. The current piece of work, which we talked about, I think, in the October meeting around preparing the building safety cases, that is ongoing. So there may be recommendations coming out of that around, we need to replace fire doors, but I think the approach we've taken is we need to assess them in the whole. So, prioritising, where the highest risk is identified, that they will be taken forward first. So we're spending, finance in the most appropriate manner, if that answers the question.
It does, but I guess more specifically the question was, do those old wooden style doors meet the FD30 specification within the policy?
Yes, so they all have fire doors present, and when they're being inspected as part of an FRA, the classification of an FD30S is basically it's a 30-minute fire door with smoke seals and protection, self-closing. So they will be checking that. Then obviously if they find doors that don't, the closer may be broken or missing a seal, that would be recommended to replace. If when they assess them generally, they say actually, because of repairs over the years or maybe damage, that they're starting to get to a point where actually, that they may not operate fully, that's when the recommendation would be to replace them for a full FD30S. And it's down to the classification around what an existing door is classified as, and then what a replacement door is. Because if you replace it, it's certified, and there's a certain protocol around installation that you have to meet. So it's around the sort of nuances around the classification of doors and installation, but specifically around that.
Okay, I mean, I'll take the point. I guess my point here is that the policy states that, for example, FD30 should be installed in high-road blocks. By the sounds of it, that's not happening imminently, but may happen at some point in the future, depending on budgets, etc.
No, they all have an FD30 fire door installed now, all of the high-rise. It's just that if you replace it, it's a certification that comes alongside it, which is slightly different, and that's just a modernisation of the standards, basically.
Okay. So I guess my general points around this policy are taking issue with zero tolerance as an approach, and I know that's the whole point of the policy, but my concern, and I know I've had lots of conversations with Phil about this and other people and lots of residents clearly, is that the problem with zero tolerance is it doesn't allow for discretion, it doesn't allow for consideration of circumstances, it doesn't allow for, most importantly, common sense. And I would say I have come across circumstances where I would argue that common sense could be applied, but under a zero tolerance policy it won't be. And I guess the query is whether there is room for, instead of zero tolerance, some kind of high standard, but with discretion, with common sense applicable in certain circumstances. I know that obviously creates work, and I know it creates uncertainty, etc., which we're trying to move away from, but the flip side of that is that it increases residential amenity and the potential benefit to those residents who want to have some ownership over the space that they live in and want to potentially have a plant pot, have stuff growing. I mean, some kind of real world examples that I've come across is the plant pots that fit securely over balconies. So during the possibility for that taken away from communal space is quite limited. There will be an amount, but there's still a good amount of space available to leave clear for a fire exit. There have been circumstances where people have been told, obviously, under a zero tolerance approach, they will need to be removed. When I would argue there's a kind of common sense argument to be made that actually if they're secured in place, it allows that residential amenity to grow things in their space, but also being safe at the same time. Other examples would be kind of fireproof materials that are attached perhaps to balconies or to railings, the kind of things like some people put up cover or kind of sheeting to give them a little bit more privacy maybe if their balcony is bars, for example. If that can be done with a fireproof material, again, there's an argument that it's not really having too much of a significant impact on the fire safety, I'd argue. And also, another one that comes up quite often is where people have, they come out of their front door onto a communal landing and say to the left, there's no other properties, there's no fire exit, there's just an area of dead space. So it's not ever going to be used as a fire exit because they're 4 floors up and there's no way down and there's no one else going that way. Whether someone's got like a small plant pot there, under a zero tolerance approach, they're going to be taken away. And I just can't see that that is necessary. I know there's been reference to Hampshire Fire and Rescue Service and their wish for there to be absolutely zero minimal risk. Obviously, from their perspective, that is their priority, that is the agenda they would push, and we need to listen to and work with them. But I think as a housing service, we have competing priorities in this area. We have, yes, fire safety absolutely has to be up there, but we also have to balance that with residential amenity and residential wishes. And where, an element, anything can be a risk. If you try and push a zero risk agenda, you're not going to get anywhere very soon because anything can be defined as a risk. Surely the argument is that you have to quantify that risk and evaluate it as part of a risk assessment process and come to a proportionate, reasonable assessment of what the level of risk is. And if there's a tiny, tiny infantile level of risk that something could happen, maybe that needs to be balanced against the wishes of those residents to have more control and ownership over their spaces. So yeah, I guess the general point I'm making, Darren, is zero tolerance, I don't think, makes for good policy making because it takes away any element of discretion or common sense.
Thank you for that, Cal. Daniel wanted to, hang on, whoa. I will ask, hang on, don't worry. I'll ask Steve or Phil to come back on Cal's. Fine. Sorry, I just didn't know what you were going to say. We don't rehearse these things, so therefore I didn't know what you were going to say.
I just didn't want the officers to answer and then they just repeat themselves. Following on from Cal's comments, is there some form of liability clause that we can add into council tenancies? And also, is there a way we could have a best practice document so that if I'm a new resident to a block and I want to put a plant pot out, I can have a document where I go, okay, these are accepted, the fire department have said these are okay, and then that way we can kind of strike a balance that Cal's obviously trying to hit, where residents can have that positive amenity in their area, but then also we're not going to have any risk associated with that. I think that might be a way of striking a balance. I don't know if that'd be plausible.
Okay, thank you for that. Trevor.
Thank you. Regarding zero tolerance, is there a view that there's been obviously many residents who've been in their property a long time, they may or may not have a bike, which they use for exercise as well. Do you anticipate any problems with your teams working with the residents in initially gently asking the resident to remove their bike? And bear in mind, when bikes are stored under stairwells, they cause an awful lot of damage as well, which is an extra cost for the council at some point in the future.
Philip or Steve?
Yeah, I've made some notes and hopefully I can answer.
If you don't, we'll come back to you.
Okay, so I think the easiest way to sort of discuss this, so you mentioned dead space as an area, so that the example you gave was out the door and left and there's no access. So there's two elements to that that we've found when trying to work with managing these risks as difficult to move forward through. So we spoke to the fire service, and again recently, only about 6 weeks ago, I've rechecked a lot of this. And they still want those areas to be kept sterile on the basis that they may have to stage equipment through there, bring fire hoses through and so on. And the other element is, although it feels like that it's not presenting risk, and perhaps practically it might not in some cases, the consistency case to persuade other residents to buy into what we need, it makes it highly challenging. So that's one element for that. The curb appeal, I think, is what you're referring to in plant pots outside of people's front doors and on the communal spaces, which we recognise. So I think actually one of the blocks that we discussed, and one we're dealing with at the minute in Highfield, the discussion is about what would residents like us to do with the ground floor communal space to make that more appealing, and can we work with them in that way, but recognising that we can't allow those items to be on the communal balconies directly outside their properties. There is the pot that you've referenced, which if anyone can imagine, it's a trough or a plant pot that kind of hooks over the balcony, and we've found those in some cases. We are still just doing a little bit of investigation around that to be sure that we don't open the door up to weight issues and so on, but we do think that's worth pursuing, because that might be helpful and a go-between, which we could do.
Great, that's great, Phil. And obviously, it's what I think residents and we would expect of the council is to use discretion and common sense in circumstances like that. I guess my argument is that this policy, as currently worded, arguably doesn't allow for that to happen, because it's zero tolerance of any personal items in communal spaces.
I'm not quite sure to answer that at the minute. The answer would still be no at the moment, because we haven't got the outcome. So it's something we're trying to recognise that's being brought to us by residents, that we should try and figure out if we can allow that or not. And then the other element is like what we've communicated to residents is you can have an item in a communal space, like a balcony, for example, that leads to a front door. We've seen people with small tables or chairs, and what we've said is in use whilst you're using it, sat on it and whatever, that's fine, we'll accept that. But the moment you're not, it has to be brought away, which comes back to you can't leave anything in a communal space like that.
So would that change under this?
Well, I think that's exactly the same as what we're saying now.
So the answer is no, Phil?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I think someone said something about what would we do about demands like bikes or other items like that. And as you mentioned, sir, it can create some damage, and it's the consistency argument. What we're ready to do is just kind of understand perhaps there might be some blocks of interest where bike storage or something similar needs some further consideration, but we haven't found that yet. Usually we've been able to persuade residents to make a bit of room in their sheds and so on. So we're ready for that, but the answer would still be, it would be zero tolerance.
Okay, is that your questions and comments, Cal?
Yeah, no, it is, thank you, and appreciate all the work that's gone into this. Obviously, I know post-Grenfell and everything else that's going on, it's really important that we do get as tight as possible on fire safety and ensure that kind of blocks are as safe as possible, places for people to live. I guess just the kind of slight pushback I'm giving is that I think sometimes discretion and common sense need to always be there as an option, and hopefully that can continue whether we use the term zero tolerance or not.
Just one more bit then. I just wanted to reassure then that the approach, and Steve's described it thoroughly in the report, but the approach is to be quite personal with the residents, really talk to them. We wouldn't just blanket a whole building without understanding what the individual needs are. Timescales can be adjusted. We recognise these things have probably been in place for some time. So it'll be a phasing approach to try and work with residents and do that in a thoughtful way.
I think the other thing just to add in there as well is that obviously the fire safety group will continue to review and monitor as we implement that. And obviously if there is anything that comes out of that, or learning or discussions with Hampshire Fire, we would obviously come back to that. But it is something that we would continue to monitor, and obviously monitor the fire risk assessments going forward to see what sort of impact that's having.
Thank you. James was also indicating.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to, I don't think we answered a point that was asked by Councillor Weems as to whether or not there's an approach where we could ask a tenant to, in effect, sign something that resolves the risk issue. The short answer to that is no, we couldn't do that, because we as the landlord are responsible for the communal areas. So we can't allow a tenant to put something there and them accept the risk if Hampshire Fire Rescue Service then struggle in the course of dealing with an incident. And just, I think, just to reinforce a few points. One is that the sign-up, process, we will absolutely make sure the policy is part of the sign-up, so any new residents coming into council housing stock will understand this approach, as well as the communication with existing residents. And I think although we are very clear in our recommendation as an officer group, that point that if there are things like the flower troughs on balconies and so on, which would be allowed going forward, then we would update the policy, update the Residents' Consortium, and make sure that that's carefully communicated. I think because there's still doubt, it's better to suggest now the zero tolerance to achieve the consistency, and then continue, as Steve said and Phil, through the fire safety working group to look at any areas where there could be some flex.
Thank you, James. Alison, could you note that in the minutes, please? Those 2 points around potential circumstances from both Phil and from James, please, just so that it forms a record. Thank you very much all. I thought I was the only sceptic about this. I have to say, so I'm intrigued there's a few others around here. That's why I was the one who asked the team to actually ask the fire service what their thoughts were. The points around Grenfell are totally correct. I do not want to have that. I don't think any of us want that at all, ever. It's one of the reasons we were forced to remove people from Leamington and Horatia houses, which was a controversial decision at the time, was the right decision, because we couldn't cope with the Grenfell horror. So there is that, which is why I asked the team to ask the fire service. And if the fire service had come back and gone with something more wishy-washy than they did, this wouldn't be here, because we carry on as we are. I'm grateful for the clarifications that Phil and James have given. I think Dan, you've had cases on Northern Parade, and I've had cases on the Eastern Road, whereby there's a lovely guy who puts out a gym on a floor that's not quite a communal walkway, but is a little bit to the right, but is a gym, and is next to a window. And people, again, on the Eastern Road have complained, you're asking us to take this stuff away, but you don't provide any locks then for the sheds at the bottom. That has been rectified. So I think all those things go in place. I think with the clarifications that Phil and James have put forwards, I think I'm in a slightly more comfortable place than I was 5 minutes ago on this. But again, we have to be guided by the fire service. And it's not just a case, Cal, of yes, but in this particular instance, as far as our firemen and firewomen are concerned. I take the point earlier on about fire doors and stuff like that, which is why I've insisted to the team that things like sprinklers and fire doors have to be an active part of the safety case, any building safety case. So with those caveats that will be in the minutes, and if they could be distributed quite quickly, that would be lovely to me and to Phil and to James, just to clarify everything. I approve that policy. Well, agree to the policy. Can't say approve it, but I agree to the policy. And on that basis, I will close this meeting at 11:04. Thank you all for coming. The YouTube link, it lasts a further 20 seconds, so please don't swear for the next 25 seconds.